Senator Raff Ciccone, welcome to Behind the Headlines, and thank you very much for joining us on this episode.
My pleasure. Great to be with you today, Adam.
Raff, before we talk about some of the questions about where you sit across, defence and national security, tell us a little bit about yourself and how your journey into the Australian Parliament. How did that all come about?
It's a good question. I think like a lot of migrants, they have a very similar story, coming to Australia for a better life, trying to escape wars or poverty. Like my family migrated from Italy in the late 60s. Both mum and dad met here separately in Australia and met and got married and had children. My grandparents, particularly my mum's side, my grandfather, my nonna, was always very much involved in the media, understanding about the lessons that he had learnt when he was young, and I wanted to make sure that his grandchildren didn't make the same mistakes. And I still vividly remember him saying to me, about making sure that you look at what goes on in politics because that can have an impact about how the life is shaped. And I think from then on, really instilled in me the importance of this thing at the time as a youngster. What is politics? I remember watching mini elections. Well, we tradition would spend every Saturday night or Saturday at my grandparents' home, and it's when elections were on. So that obviously piqued my attention. But what is this thing that happens every 3 or 4 years in Australia, both at a federal and at a state level? And understanding that the sacrifices my grandparents made. So that's not just my parents, but the grandchildren, so myself and my brother and other members of our family, our other cousins, would have a better life. And when we look back and see the sacrifices that many migrants have made, regardless of where they have come from, they come with one purpose, and it's to make sure that their children and their children have a better life. And it doesn't matter who you are. I think that is fundamental about migrants that come to Australia. The fundamental success of our migration history here in Australia is because migrants that do come want to make a better life, want to make the sacrifices so their children, their family can prosper. And from then, I decided to get a little bit more active, particularly at school when we had school elections for SRC and school captain, well, being able to be elected to both. And got involved in the Labor Party at the age of 16, and I decided to bite the bullet and put my name forward after Steve Bracks won in 1999. I found him such an inspiration, both him and whoever thought the my federal leader at the time, King Beasley, were both people that I attributed into my first speech in the Senate when I was first elected as a senator back in 2019.
Mm.
And then from then on, you look back at how quickly time has gone past the last 26 years, as a member of the Labor Party, being fortunate and having the honour to now also be a member of Parliament, representing the great people in the state of Victoria, but also working very closely with many Labor leaders, Labor members who at every election put on the cap, the t-shirts, help us at the booths to make sure that later governments are elected. And it's just great to be able to pass on that story, I guess, and so do you, Adam. I'm sure very similar to you and many others in the Jewish community where, parents, grandparents, great grandparents have paid the ultimate sacrifice, want to make sure their family prosper. And, it's just something about the migration story that we should all be very proud of here in Australia.
I completely agree with that, Rafi. It is the Australian story. It is the Australian migration story that this country has been, in Jewish we say, a goldena Medina, a golden state, an opportunity for families to avoid, the difficulties of war-torn parts of the world and create opportunity. And I've seen it in the Italian community, we've seen it in the Greek community, we've seen it in so many communities. There's so many wonderful parts to the great Australian story. Let's get into where you are now. You've had this incredible journey, and now you sit across intelligence, defence, and foreign affairs. You sit at the heart of those committees, the joint committees of Parliament. And Raf, they're about as serious as portfolios get in dealing with issues in this country. Before we get into it, what drew you into this space and what has surprised you most about stepping into these roles as a leading Australian figure in intelligence, defence, and foreign affairs?
I think really what drew me was about the importance of these portfolio. And that's just how the other portfolios that governments and parliaments have aren't important. But thinking in light of life experience that since being in Parliament now since 2019, but growing up and still for me very like remember the time when I was finishing VCE in September 11 had occurred. And that sort of drew my, I think, attention very strongly in that national security and defence space. Not something that I had ever really thought about. For me, yeah, education, health education, it was certainly at the forefront, like many people in the movement. But I then started to look into what defence and national security, and the more I looked into it, the more you realise how interconnected it was, not just on its own, but throughout the whole economy. Without secure borders, without a strong defense, a strong deterrence, can't have a strong economy, can't protect the values that many people have fought for and defended, including the values that your family are also imposing on you to be good adults as you get older and want to pass on those traditions to future generations. So for me, defense is national security right at the heart of what it really is to be a member of parliament. Uh, and there were opportunities to become the chair and be involved in those committees. And I really am thankful for the movement to be able to give me the opportunity to be able to put my hand up and support me. And when we look at our region, particularly now in the Pacific, the threats that we have from countries like China, smaller countries like North Korea, what it means to work closely with our friends in the Pacific, making sure that we can also help them out with infrastructure, with investments in healthcare and education, but also teaching them not to rely on countries like China for free money, free funds, because ultimately there is nothing like a free lunch, very low restrictions attached. And what we are seeing at the moment, a number of those countries that are starting to undermine some arrangements that may have went into public to China. These are real threats, not just to Australia, but to our region. And I think it's important that we, as a country, have a role to play in this part of the world. There's a role to play about that we're on conflicts here in the world to offer a hand and to allow people not to come and settle here in Australia, like we have done for many, many decades. And here, I think that's really about who we are as a country in an international, in a global community. And it's important that we continue to do that. And I think the work that our ADF do, our intelligence agency, in being able to respond to incidents, to security threats is so important. And we need people who will appreciate that work. And that's why I am where I am today and really enjoy. It's a big world out there, big scary world, but it's
Yeah.
one that you need people to be able to say, right, let's rip the band-aid off and let's go for it because we've got to do our bit to protect this great country.
It may be scary and unstable, but nevertheless, the mission of protecting ourselves and those around us is an important part. And that's such a central element.
Look at what happens like a country like Russia, like one day decides to invade another country. Like, this could happen easily and at that door. And we need to be able to respond. We need to plan and we need to be able to show and demonstrate that we have the capability of able to have a deterrence to countries that decide to do that. And
Yeah.
also call out that behaviour that is not acceptable.
Yeah. So, for Australia, I mean, we know our size, we know our capability, our military is small in a relative sense, given where we are in the world and the strategic importance lying at, the bottom of the Pacific in that sense. So we've always relied on alliances. Historically, it was with the United Kingdom before World War II, and then with particularly since then United States. Given the nature of an inward view of America right now, we can argue about right or wrong or good or bad, but a real a tendency to put America first. Accepting that as the reality, how confident are you that our alliance with the United States will function in the way we're going forward in a more chaotic and scary world and under this sustained geopolitical pressure that is being applied?
Look, alliances and partnerships are perhaps the greatest strengths of the democratic nations. They are typically deeper trust and if like greater cooperation between democracies, regardless of who holds office of the president or the prime minister of the day. With the United States, they are our closest friend, our closest ally. Friends often disagree, but they remain friends, and it is so important that that friendship continues. I know it will, and there is deep trust between Australia and the US. President Trump and Communist Albanese had a very close working relationship. And it's what made that what might be reported in the media. You can see the bond when the two met recently in Washington. And what we need to realise is that it's so important for countries like Australia to build those alliances, not just with the US, but with our region. That's why we've also tried to reach out and stabilise, normalise relations with China, continue to ensure that trade, we've got the trade deficits, and we can go back to where it was when we took office. So when we came into office, there was around a $20 billion deficit in trade with China. We managed to get that back to about $15.5 billion back of that trade. So that's a great achievement, and that has economic benefits to us here domestically. But there's always the view that where countries do trade, we're less likely to go to war with each other as well. And I think it's important that, particularly what we're now seeing in the Middle East, like with Iran, well, there is a view that people won't be able to sit down and talk through the issues and then work out, okay, there's certain countries that have been bad actors. How do we deal with them? And how do we, as a global community, work out a way that we can all sort of agree a path forward? And fortunately for Australia, I believe that our interests are aligned with a number of our natural partners, like the US, like the UK, many in the Middle East, with Israel, with many in Southeast Asia. There are values that we all share. And for that reason, with every confidence that exists in alliances, particularly our mutually beneficial ones, the US will remain. And it also goes to, the heart of what is a rules-based international order that needs to continue. We need to protect how we operate internationally. We can't allow countries to destabilize, to use proxies, to destabilize, to invoke terror, invoke hatred, to spread violence around the world. And we need to call it out. But you can't do that on their own. And I think we do acknowledge that Australia is a middle power. But with other middle powers, we can actually push back as one, as a global deterrent. And that's why those partnerships, those alliances are so, so important. And having
Yeah.
friendships with the United States is equally important for 'em.
So, the question has been, and, the Prime Minister of Canada came to have a chat about it. Are we operating in a values based, rules based order, or are we moving into a transactional world which is being led by the hegemons, America, China, well, Russia may not be anymore, but certainly the larger countries? Have we moved into a transactional world? And if we have, and the rules based order is behind us, and the fundamental premise of the rules based order was that we would resolve conflict through negotiations, compromise, and rules, as opposed to transactions where might is right. Is that our future, or are we witnessing a just a small shift given the nature of the leaders of these large countries? Are we heading into instability over the long term or over the short term?
I still am a big believer that the rules-based international order will persist and continues to. There will always be fluctuations or turbulent times or speed humps along the way. We're probably in one of those at the moment. But there's also a lot going on around the world. As you know, we've had the conflicts in the Middle East, and for good reason. The United States and Israel making it very clear that Iran needs to stop its behaviour towards the state of Israel, needs to stop promoting or exporting terrorism around the world, and you can't just do that by peaceful negotiations sometimes. There are times where military force or military action is required. And what the US and Israel have demonstrated is that sometimes those actions are required and it may not always be popular, but how else do you review a regime that continues to undermine those values that we all share around the world and are hell bent on destroying and obliterating the state of Israel? You cannot allow a country like that to operate where they use proxies and other means to continually target Jews and other good people or illegal democratic nations. And I think the complexity of international affairs can't always be summarized in a 30-second news grab at home on the nightly news. And unfortunately, in the world that we now live in with social media, I feel like people are also less willing to absorb that level of information unless it's within a very short video or a message on their phone. And the complexities about how international leaders, so I know, for instance, our foreign minister regularly meets with other foreign ministers around the world about how they tackle these issues. And it's important that we allow governments and have faith in our systems that allow governments to actually deal with other similar sized governments to be able to provide a path forward. And I think that is what is happening with the moderates. I honestly do think that the world's, generally speaking, is in a good place, but we are just unfortunately having to deal with the current crisis now with the fuel. But at the end, there will be light at the end of this one. And I really do hope that so we assist with calling out and we can head on those bad people, those bad actors that continue to undermine our values and our decided.
I want to come back to, is the world in a good place in a second, but you've raised Iran, of course, and we're seeing that conflict in particular and the wider 2.5 year, Western Asia is the language I prefer, Middle East. But we're seeing that those conflicts spill into Australian street and discourse. And you're at the heart of a lot of the intelligence assessments around this. At what point, Raf, does social cohesion and the breakdown of it itself become a national security concern?
Well, I think that's why governments have now set up the Royal Commission into disabilities and social coherence because they acknowledge that this is serious. It goes to the heart and fabric of who we are as a society. Where in the moment that we don't have social cohesion, what do we really have? And as we discussed earlier about that proud migration story, people want to live in a peacefully, regardless of whether you're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, or any others religion or no religion for that matter. People want to get along. And unfortunately, there are
I'm sorry,
people.
I have to challenge that. We're seeing, that, and I am going to challenge that. And I agree with you that the majority do. I don't think the vast majority of Australians do want to get on. But we're seeing the extreme left take over our streets and march every week for 2 years. And we've seen the chanting and we've seen the burning and the firebombing from that perspective. And now we're seeing it on the extreme right, demonstrating, booing at Anzac. It's like, one has taught the other that social cohesion is breaking down, and more people seem to be breaking those bonds of social cohesion that the vast majority of Australians want. So I have to challenge that comment. And especially now we saw the Greek choir going, well, we don't want to sing with the Jewish people because of what's happened in Palestine. All of this has an effect. So, Raf, are we dealing with it well enough? to reclaim that statement of yours, which I agree with, but reclaim that statement that the vast majority of people just want to get along? Or are we losing that?
Look, I don't discount what you said. I think people do want to get along. I just worry that social media and sometimes something in mainstream media also use certain incidents or events and amplify what I still believe is a minority, but give it a much larger platform than what it deserves. And unfortunately, now with modern technology, it is easy now to get a message across throughout a whole spectrum of individuals throughout our community. It's easy, to organise protests, as you say, those weekly protests that were occurring. It's now easy to get messages out using social media platforms. And social media platforms often have a responsibility about what content is placed on their platforms.
So, Raf, do you think we're, as a society, and certainly from a governance perspective, are we sufficiently equipped legally and institutionally to deal with the rise of ideologically driven extremism, which doesn't always present itself as traditional terrorism of the worst kind that we've seen? But are we equipped? And if not, what do we need to do?
The following attack with the Jewish community governments, as you know, acted through that legislation to strengthen the national security framework or even core parliament. And central to that was the Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism Bill, which established a framework for the designation of prohibited hate groups. Uh, We also know, particularly from agencies, that certain actors deliberately operate just below the threshold for legal consequence, and namely listing as a terrorist organisation. And this legislation empowers government of the day to protect everyone, all Australians, from the serious social and physical harms that are caused by these organisations. And that said, though, we will never be able to legislate away all the harm, but where we believe that certain organisations can do harm to us, then we should be able to pull them in. And I think that's where I still think there is some work to do. That's why we've established the Royal Commission. But our universities, for example, and other similar institutions also need to step up. And I think it's still trying to struggle to balance their commitments to freedom of speech and academia with their obligations to ensure that students and staff are also safe on campus. So, I think government has a very large role to play, but many entities, many organisations, whether they're universities or schools or other institutions that are respected by members of the community, need to also look at their own internal policies and procedures. From a PJCIS focus, I mean, that I chair, and Australia has a very strong modern counterterrorism framework, but it's one that has to always adapt to new and evolving threats. And agencies like ASIO and the AFK, they do work very closely. They also now need to work very closely with their state counterparts under a national coordinated framework. But what we're also seeing here is extremism and people that are being radicalized don't always fit those old labels. And that's why our approach has to adapt and needs to be broad. Earlier this year, the NJCIS backed the listing of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, right, for the IRGC as a state sponsor of terrorism under the criminal code. And at the moment, we are reviewing the listing of Hizb ut as a prohibited hate group under their new framework that was passed back in January. So there's a lot of work that has to be done. Obviously, in a nutshell, Adam, unfortunately, terrorism is evolving and it always keeps changing. But governments have to also respond. Agencies have to respond, and law enforcement bodies have to respond. And as a parliament, we need to make sure that the legislation is also modern and keeps up with new evolving threats.
So, speaking of threats, what are the two or three threats keeping our intelligence community, I would say, up at night, but most focused right now? And are Australians underestimating the seriousness of these threats?
I'd say the main threats for us right now are probably foreign interference and espionage, like the rise of political motivated violence, sadly, and cyber attacks that could easily disrupt critical infrastructure. And we've seen many examples of that where people's private personal details have been taken away from these institutions and placed in the dark web for sums of money. Economic cost of espionage alone is estimated in billions annually, and the nature of violent extremism has also changed. It's less organized, more unpredictable, and often is accelerated online. And when you look at new technologies like AI, of how that can do to amplify this, can actually blow guns on if you deal with this full like deeply. But these are big challenges that governments and more broader society have today. It is a priority of any government is to make sure that the safety of its citizens is at its core business. And the threats environment is a lot more complex than it was, let's say, decades ago. But espionage and foreign interference have certainly increased. The number of cases have increased, including attempts to influence communities. And as we mentioned earlier, right, you've got countries like Iran that constantly fund proxies to do their dirty work. And it sadly have resulted in at least two terrorist attacks here in Australia, one in Sydney, one in Melbourne, primarily targeting the Jewish community.
Yeah.
And this is the work where governments have to look at how can we make sure that our agencies are best equipped to deal with these issues.
The Prime Minister expelled the Iranian ambassador because there was an intelligence provided a direct link between the ambassador and the work of criminal gangs in firebombing synagogues, as I understand it. What have we seen since then from the Iranian regime in wanting to influence and promote violence in Australia against not just the Jewish community, but the breakdown of Australia itself?
Well, I guess what we have seen is a continuation of them targeting and harassing the wings of the Gas Strip here in Australia. On 18 was living at purchase territory. If people who are against the regime back in Tehran, who want to see change, many family members are quite concerned about what their relatives are having to go through for at the moment. Since the war began, the internet has effectively been cut off. We don't really have a strong sense about what is happening on the grounds every day, but there are snippets where people can get information out, and what we do see is quite horrific. Tens of thousands of people have been massacred in Iran simply for protesting, for being able to express their views, things that we take for granted every day here in Australia. And I know the world community is looking very close to that is happening a bit away from onwards. And that is why, Iran needs to be held accountable for its actions. And as I said earlier in the interview, I think the United States and Israel, well, rightly have pursued Iran because they are, in some ways, the core of a lot of the world's terrorism. They continue to promote and fund, support terrorism, export things. And it's just not the world that we want to live in. We need to call up this bad behavior and actually deal with it.
Ralph, I want to come back to the larger geopolitical and then we want to zoom in on the disinformation in Australia piece and the influence operations that these regimes undertake. But you make the comment about destabilizing, right? That Iran is a destabilizer. The other two great destabilizers that we know are Russia and China. And I just want to talk about and ask you about Russia in a minute. Russia is, famous for its troll farms. We all know how it tries to influence, American elections. It may have influence around the world and destabilizing Europe. How much of a threat, especially because, Russia is now locked into this struggle with Ukraine, how much of a continued threat to the Western world does Russia still pose from this disinformation, misinformation, destabilization tool that it keeps operating? Or has that diminished somewhat?
I think a lot of the activities are still occurring. I mean, their focus is probably Europe. There's a bit of foreign, but that's not so we're immune from any of their activities. And I know, agencies There's reports of this last year where ASD were able to take down, the connectivity center in Russia that was scamming Australians and many people around the world, but Western countries. And we have to keep monitoring and using our infrastructure that we have, our equipment that allows us to monitor these bad actors. And we're not immune from Russia's bad behavior, but the main focus for us has generally been in our region, and that does cover countries like China and what other support that we can provide to countries in the Pacific, encouraging them not to do deals with the PRC. They'll really offer infrastructure at a discounted price or for free, where they are putting their own equipment and effectively allowing their agencies to spy on their own citizens. And that's something that we have concerns and have raised on multiple occasions now. And we want to make sure that the picture is got it, listening they do. To keep its path to making sure that it can surveillance on its citizens outside its jurisdiction. And we still the scenario we've been playing and with the telecommunications network over in the United Kingdom and the issues that played out there, similar to what the threat in Australia some years ago. We've got to be careful, guys. We as a nation are having an almost wide open about what is allowed to tourist in this country.
Yeah.
We just do not want to put our citizens at risk.
And I've always thought it was a no-brainer that if Chinese telecommunication companies, by law, must provide access to the Chinese Communist Party, then from that hypothesis comes, well, if you install systems in the Australian infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, you are by clearly opening that up to Chinese Communist Party interference. Certainly access and therefore interference. I mean, it was always a no-brainer that Huawei and those needed to be excluded because by law they have to have a backdoor for Chinese authorities. And yet it still seems to be debated. I want to talk about China. You've mentioned China a number of times. Let's talk about it. The what's famously or infamously quoted is that, you know, China will invade Taiwan by, 2030, and we all better get prepared. And someone in defense is holding a clock that is counting down the probability of that happening, right? And, we all have that imaging in our mind. Talk to us about the reality of that scenario, certainly that threat, and what the implications are in our region and for the wider geopolitical world, especially in a post Iran and Russia Ukraine world. I mean, it's so complicated now, but that 2030 threat, and then how real is it in this changing world that we're in?
I think you're right to say it's a very complicated world that we live in. We're trying to really go about the funny world that we live in does terrify me, I'll be honest. Yeah. But I suspect it's always been a bit of a terrifying world because at what point in time in humanity is it never right? So, I think it's important that we're always being on guard. Any country has to, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, or any other like matter, but we as a country, and we are this fortunate that we are somewhat surrounded by water, so people do need to get a new plane, but like we government, not there's not many Australians immune, I guess, from the events that are occurring around the place. I mean, we're doing here, I'll reach out to the news, our Multicultural Society. There are lots of diasporas here that have connections around the world and are impacted by various conflicts. And we, as a multicultural society, have to also be mindful about supply activities to also have a reaction to people who how they view the world. And that can also be a positive about we've been educating fellow citizens about the events that are occurring and why national security is so important, why investing in defence is so important. All of the right criticisms around AUKUS. I think people, and partly the media, have failed to also appreciate the value that AUKUS has. It's not just about submarines. We've got Core 1, and there's a lot of focus on investments that the government is making to make sure that our submarine fleets can continue to operate when the Collins class submarines retire. And we need to make sure there's a smooth transition towards new subs. But Pillar 2, and that's where often there's a lot of excitement that comes out of the opposite arrangements where there's investment in AI, advanced technologies that can also help us in deal with climate change, like dealing with all the making level productive. And I think that is where people have actually underestimated the value of the facility. After making us safer, as a country, actually will go to the heart of our economic prosperity. The amount of direct jobs that will come out of it are in the things of thousands. And I think that's something that always gets overshadowed by the bigger picture, which is our submarines and when are we going to receive our first sub? So I think it's important that we look at these investments, these deals that we have, and look at the benefits that we're all going to be able to see. We're effectively replacing the car industry that still exists here in Australia. And I think that that's a good thing. Like we're going to have high-tech jobs that there'll be people who used to work in those industries, they could transition back into the submarine industry. And the supply chain also offers enormous opportunities, not just for the states where the subs will be built in service, like in South Australia and Western Australia, but Victoria, which has a very large network of manufacturing, and will be able to provide support to our supply chain businesses. And I'm really excited to see Victoria will be central to that, into supplying and supporting the development of the submarines when they are made here. in
Th
Victoria.
there's a lot of opportunity to that, and I do wanna talk about Pillar 2 and AI and cross back to some of the earlier parts of the conversation. But I do specifically want to hold you down to the conversational point around China, its designs on Taiwan by 2030, whether that's the right date or not the right date, but its real designs on Taiwan, what you really think it may occur, and what are the geopolitical implications of this prospect of an invasion of Taiwan?
Well, I think those matters are ones that government will always be one thing. I mean, the Chinese government and the president will have to be confident that if they were economic go down a path that they will want to make sure that it's done in a way that is peaceful. I don't think any government of the PRC to date has ever wanted to insert into the conflict. So that's the irony. I mean, we saw what happened in Hong Kong. There was a smooth transition from the United Kingdom to the PRC. And I suspect that they'll be wanting to work diplomatically to make sure that that continues, if that is what they are pursuing by that day of 2030.
But let's say Taiwan doesn't want to join China. I've never bought the one China idea. I understand the politics of it, but having been to Taiwan some years ago, I, I do see it differently. I've been to China too, but let's say Taiwan says, no, we're not interested. Thanks for the diplomacy. We get what you're doing. No, we're going to remain independent.
And like you, I've been to Taiwan, and a big supporter of them maintaining their autonomy. And I think ultimately good for the people of Taiwan to make that determination whether they want to be part of a PRC or not. But I do think that the people of Taiwan ultimately they don't mind working alongside the PRC, but they see themselves as Taiwanese,
Yes.
not as part of mainland China or the PRC. And what will be important is countries in the region, including Australia, will need to assess the situation should that ever occur. Now, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. I mean, but I know there have been many statements and a lot of advice from people to suggest there are certain dates in mind. We don't know for certain, but that is something that Xi Jinping is thinking of in mind. But I think they'll also be watching very carefully about what is occurring at the moment in the Middle East and how the world responds, how the United States and countries like Israel are responding and making assessments. But that's where countries of Australia can't act alone. We need to work with other like-minded countries of a similar size. And what is important is that we also have a deterrence, and that is why we are investing heavily in modernising our ATF at the moment. Not just about focus our army, our air force, our navy, and we have made recent announcements, as you know, that go to looking at how we can use drones, how we can use unmanned naval assets, how we can better equip an army with missiles and long range missiles. Like missiles that can go from 5 to 1,000 kilometers in range. We need deterrence so that should the worst occur, should China decide to unilaterally target Taiwan, that we will have an ability to be part of a much more broader deterrence that could then allow Taiwan to either defend itself or be a severe deterrence of China to think twice about doing something. Because if they do that, then they have to deal with the consequences of having to deal with countries in the region. And I think that's where the collective discussion is like so important.
It's a precarious situation, isn't it, really?
Is because we're trying to deal with a hypothetical, but also no one tells you that they're going to strive as well at the same time. So I think it's one of those scenarios where you need to prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. But knowing that if you don't prepare for the worst, then the worst could potentially happen, and you don't want to be left back be backfooted on these issues. I think it's so important that we are prepared as a country, acknowledging that if there is a conflict in our region, we can't do it alone, but we need to work with like-minded countries, with friends, with allies in the region.
Yeah. And, but we also had the lessons around us. We had the lessons from Russia. When they invaded Ukraine, it was after a number of steps they'd undertaken, including the invasion of Crimea and Ossetia, southern Georgia, including lots of, verbal language that they were going to do it. China has been expanding its military in the South China Sea illegally, as in the International Convention of, I think it was International Law of the Sea. They've lost that case. They've expanded unilaterally. They're using debt diplomacy. I mean, they're doing things. They're sending fleets and airplanes all over Taiwan. I don't think it's a huge conjecture to say that there's a threat scenario here and Australia is working towards it.
I think
Having to deal with the possibility, especially in a post-Trump America, where who knows what the next president will be like and whether or not it will be as aggressive as President Trump or not in the face of Chinese threats. It's a very, very complicated scenario. And Raf, it's important that people like you steer us well through this because it is, as you said, scary and it's a world of conflict internally and geopolitically. I want to come back to this idea about information warfare, not just economic sovereignty. We know Australia, needs to be more resilient in its supply chain. That's the world we now inhabit. We rely on importing. It was the Conservatives who shut down most industries in Australia, in order to drive efficiency, and the cost of that has been now resilience. We're walking down that road again, but we're also now in an information warfare world, not just an economic, military, but information warfare. You've touched on it around, disinformation and the way that is sort of pervading the cyberspace. Disinformation, misinformation, narrative warfare are now shaping public opinion in real time. How exposed is Australia to foreign influence operations in that space now?
Well, I know the Director General Security, that's what has been very clear that foreign interference and it's these three threats that I mentioned earlier. And social media in particular divides adversaries with the means of influencing public opinion and fracturing trust between people and institutions. But rather than reach for maybe censorship like our sort of authoritarian laws, we need to move to combat foreign interference with greater communication, engagement, and information, and ideally offline, and where necessary, through action by our security agencies. And I think that's sort of how education is so important how we tackle disinformation and misinformation and this narrative warfare. And unfortunately, I think will only continue to get worse. As you know, the government has made it clear that it bans certain apps from being placed on government issued phones, like TikTok. Well, there's good reason why. But, I'm a big believer our democratic systems are resilient enough to withstand disinformation or sustain information welfare. I believe in our voting system, and I still think that we do here in Australia is world's best. And I not frustrate a lot of people who have to attend a polling station, but it also means that we're not in a position that allows any government to be able to corrupt a system extremely. And what we see in the US, where systems come down, or there might be issues in Europe where certain countries, I'm not sure whether the results are legitimate because it may get interfered by external factors. But I think we have a system that is resilient in Australia. We're very lucky. That's not to say there can't be any threats, and we are constantly monitoring for that. But there are many reports in recent years that many people, I touch on this, and not just in Australia, but all democratic countries have unfortunately less confidence in democratic systems, and that could be a result of what they are seeing online and social media platforms. It may also be the performance of many parties in regoverning countries. Also, partly be due to people feeling that the system no longer delivers for them. And it's so important that governments have a duty to make sure that when they are in office, that they continue to deliver for the people. And in the very moment that going was, you do allow or give rise to external factors to be able to attack and exploit that sentiment. And I think that's what we've seen with some countries over the years. People need to have confidence in their government, confidence in the government is actually doing and delivering for them, their families, but also for the next generation.
Needing to have that. And, polls I've seen, 61%, it's an extraordinary number, have low trust or no trust in, government, big business. We're at a very fragile time, easily led down the wrong roads, but I agree with you. I think our democratic resilience is strong.
And I think that the investment, greater investment, to be honest, in civics education and teaching people about our democracy, why the democracy matters, legal values, why it's so important. Sure, I mean, democratic nations have room for poo, but we also know that when that sort of compared with other alternatives, and sometimes, they might do a high standard of living, greater human rights, and more open society, and both in economic and opportunity, a little bit more about both other continuing to educate people about the value of our democratic systems. And it's something that I think the education system probably needs to look at, and governments need to fund both from a Commonwealth and a state level, teaching our kids when they're at school about the importance of our democratic systems and why they exist.
And why memory is so important. Began this podcast with we know what our parents and grandparents did to find a place that was safe, free, and allowed them to grow their families in security. And that's disconnected now in the third and fourth generations, naturally, logically. The outrage of social media has made that more complicated. But the other one, and it's coming back to the point you've made, Raf, around artificial intelligence. AI is accelerating everything from including influence operations. I don't know if this statistic is correct, but I've read it that 45% of all social media is synthetic, is not, you know, true in its sense. It's been conjured, but also an intelligence gathering and in all spheres of life. So my question is, in the position you're in, are governments keeping up with AI, or are we already behind the curve and lost the fight to the hyper tech companies and the nasties like China and Russia who've doubled down on this? Where do you think we are? Are we too far behind or are we there?
Let me answer this way. I think governments naturally are slower adopters of new technologies. And I think you'd expect that because they will want to evaluate the lay of the land before they decide on whether they provide a framework with regulation around the use of such technologies. That's also it's a bad thing, but obviously naturally governments are slow adopters of such technologies. So in this case, AI, then the private sector.
Yeah.
I think where we are going at the moment, given some experience with robo debt some years ago, and what happened there when governments, don't take into consideration or take a considered approach to integrate new technologies into its programs, we saw that was an absolute mess and cost the Commonwealth millions of dollars, but also sadly cost women lives, women people.
But that wasn't AI, that was automation without a human in the loop, right? AI is different technology.
Where governments are not using a framework in place and aren't looking at how best to adopt new technologies without considered approach how best to use that. And that's why I think it's important governments are slow at making sure that they look at how these new technologies or technologies that come up are working and working close with industry to make sure that there are, I guess, an agreed set of pathways that allows both government and industry to really collaborate together to make sure that it does actually productivity way towards the economy. You don't want governments to unilaterally make decisions and then have consequences as a result. But when it comes to security agencies in particular, I'm very confident that they are right. That if this new technology is cutting edge, it's innovative. We might no doubt stay ahead of the threats. And enable them to look at ways that we can assist our agencies to disseminate information. And we know that they are doing that work at the moment. And AI is certainly accelerating the threat environment, but we're also not standing still. The government had already announced this year some guardrails for data centres and AI infrastructure to support Australia's economy, energy transition, water sustainability, and invested in skills and jobs. And looking at ways that we can also help its institutions at universities and hospitals to strengthen their research and innovation to tackle things like cancer. We've also announced a national AI plan, and it's a very clear direction that will capture the economic benefits of this new technology while ensuring that Australians feel safe and know that the governments have put frameworks and guardrails in place so that we can get the best out of this new technology. And that's not to say, Adam, that it won't evolve. It will. Last week, we signed a memorandum of understanding with Microsoft, a $25 billion AI cloud investment. It's the largest ever in the country, and that's going to run to the end of the decade. And that'll significantly expand AI supercomputing and data centers and many cloud infrastructures across the country. So, there are opportunities here, great jobs, but we also got to train the next generation of people into these high skill, high paying jobs. And that's also going to be very important.
That's gonna be critical. So, coming to the end of this, in a world where RAF power and influence, is increasingly shaped not just by government, but by platforms and networks and narratives and social media, I have to ask you the question, who actually holds power now to direct the course of events for our society? And I don't mean that in a conspiratorial sense. I mean that in, the dispersal of power is so broad and these technologies are accelerating it. And it's all about networks. Where does power lie?
I still believe that power still lies with the people. At the end of the day, the people, the ones that set their vision for the country, even though they may elect politicians, the community leaders in parliament, but they all equally have the power to elect various people in their local communities. And governments still maintain responsibility for many, many aspects of our life, like security, foreign policy, etc. But fundamentally, what I think has changed is the speed and the scale at which information now moves, the way that we're able to communicate, and the way that platforms and networks can shape public debate. But I think it's still incumbent and on the individual to ensure that they challenge what is put to them. I don't take things for granted when put to me. I always question and push back and ask the questions that you're asking me today. It's important that we continue to question. Just because there's a new technology doesn't mean that it's doing something less for me. It actually means that it's another tool that I have at my disposal that can help me learn and also challenge and hopefully set up a better future for my family and my children and your children. And we've got a responsibility as a generation to make sure that whatever technologies that we have today and what will come in the future, we know that AI today will become redundant at some point in the future. We've got to create new challenges and new opportunities for the future generations. And
Yeah.
well, whether it comes with misinformation or foreign interference or cyber activity, these issues will evolve. These threats will continue to evolve, but so will the opportunities. And it's incumbent on individuals and society collectively to make sure that we have the power or the view of the ultimate keys. And I think that is so important that people need to understand it's the collective that ultimately, as they finally say,
So, with that in mind, and my last question then, right, with the power of the collective, while we live in this world that is increasingly informationally fragmented and algorithmically driven, and power is distributed and influence and networks are more and more distributed. Raf, what does effective leadership look like in this new world? And I need to add a question here. I'm very influenced by a conversation I had only a couple of weeks ago with Ambassador Dennis Ross. And one of the things he talked about with President Trump and the whole Iran war was he didn't shape the narrative correctly. And he's created, as a consequence of of not shaping the narrative, a problem around trust and engagement at scale around the world, right? Leaving aside alliance issues. But so, from an effective leadership perspective, do governments need to start thinking more like media machines than, institutions in order to help guide us through all this? And what does that mean for the leaders in society and in corporations? Where's leadership in all of this?
I think leadership is about building public trust. And like Miriam L, and trust is so important. And trust through transparency, accountability, but also conviction. I think what people want from their leaders, people who have a vision for them, their families, their country. And we may disagree with some policies that leaders might have, but you still can respect them for having those views. And I think the moment where you lose the respect, you might have the great views of the world, or great vision, but if you don't have the respect of the people, everything else is secondary. And as leaders, it is so important that we continue to build that trust. Being open, being honest, and just being who you are. I think authenticity is so important. I think, that is why you've seen so many Peruvian leaders around the world. Ones that are prepared to speak their mind, that are authentic, will ultimately succeed in life. And the focus should always be on making sure that real citizens have access to pre information so they can make informed decisions, but done in a way that gives those individuals confidence that what you are articulating, what you want to change for a country or for a community will benefit the majority of people. And I feel like that politics today is probably no different to what it was when I was born or from when you were born. But what has changed is the information and what is available at our fingertips. And it's that information exchange that has resulted, I think, more of us having nuanced conversations, a lot more robust conversations, but very different views about the world. And unfortunately, it does come with a lot of bad actors, and it also brings a lot of good opportunities and positive information for us to be able to engage with and have, I think, much more robust and respectful debates. But unfortunately, in the world that we're living today too, it can't please everyone, and we have to acknowledge that. Like, you've got to be honest and open and quite genuine to yourself about who you are and the values you believe in. And it's so important to be true to yourself.
Mm. On that positive note about leadership and society, Senator Raff Ciccone, it has been an absolute delight to have you on Behind the Headlines. Long may you continue to be at the centre of parliamentary life and guiding our society authentically towards the vision and the values that you share with us and for all Australia. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.